Okay. Press *1. All right, well, good afternoon and welcome to the webinar called Reverse Transfer, Hawaii's Experience. My name is Jason Taylor. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Utah and an OCCRL faculty affiliate. And before we get started, I have a couple logistical announcements. First, we are recording this webinar, and we will post the webinar online and distribute it via email within a couple days of the webinar. Second, if you have any technical questions or concerns, use the questions box to submit those to us, and we will respond as soon as possible. Finally, we have time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers with our colleagues from the University of Hawaii system who are sharing their work today. So please submit your questions throughout the webinar using the questions box, and we will have time to address those questions at the end of the webinar. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Debra Bragg, to introduce the webinar.
Great. Thanks, Jason, and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and special thanks to our colleagues out in Hawaii. We're very excited to be part of Credit When It's Due, and by we, I mean the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. Our office has been involved in working with all of the 15 states that are funded by the Credit When It's Due collaborative of funders, and very pleased that that initiative continues to grow, has added a 16th state, and a number of states across the country really have been quite involved in this work. In doing our work, we've had really been blessed with the opportunity to get to know what the states are doing in terms of changing policy and practices that are sometimes system-wide, as we'll see in the Hawaii example today at the University of Hawaii. And really to look at how institutions are engaged and really dig deep enough, too, that we often are talking to students more and more. We're doing our work at that level so that we really understand what impact this Credit When It's Due initiative has on the students. So I don't know, Jason, should I turn it back to you, or would you like me to say more generally about the initiative?
Sorry, Deb, I'm trying to advance the slide here, and I appear to be having a slight technical difficulty, so give me just one moment.
All right. Well, I can say a little bit more then, because I think I know where we're headed. Credit When It's Due was initiated originally by the Lumina Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and then a number of other foundations, including USA Fund, Helios, the Greater Texas Foundation now, and I'm sure I might be missing some, but those are the major funders of this work, and the Gates Foundation is really the funder of our research initiative. We began our work with 12 states who signed on in the fall of 2012, and those original 12 states have been wrapping up their grants this summer and early fall, so that those initiatives have really only recently, in some cases, provided us with some of the student level data that we are needing to really look at the impact of the initiative. Well, that looks great. We're here today to really look in depth then at as I said, at the state of Hawaii. We did an earlier webinar with folks from Tennessee, which is also on the OCCRO website. The map that you see in front of you now gives you the national picture, really. It shows in red the 16 states that are funded by the Funders Collaborative. And those 16 states have almost 500 higher education institutions, 2-year and 4-year colleges that are involved. The awarding of the degrees, you can see, has grown tremendously. From the first year we began tracking reverse transfer degree conferral in 2014, and as you can see, tremendous growth by 2015. But still, many of the states have not reported fully on the number of degrees they've awarded, and many of the states still do not consider themselves to have fully scaled this initiative. So it's still growing, and I think it's a little premature to really be able to say exactly what the impact of credit when it's due will be. And that's the reason for the webinar series. So at this point, I'll turn it back to you, Jason, to introduce today's speakers.
Thanks, Deborah. So we are delighted to have Gary Rodwell and Erica Lacro with us from the University of Hawaii system. Gary is works at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and has been instrumental in moving reverse transfer forward. And Erica Lacro is the Chancellor of Honolulu Community College and has also played a major leadership role at the system. So Gary and Erica, I have unmuted you, so we'll turn it over to you, and when you'd like me to advance the slide, just indicate next slide and I'll do that.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's a very big pleasure to be here on the webinar today. My name is Gary Rodwell, and I work in technology, and I'm with Dr. Lacro.
Hello.
So I understand from this format that other users will be muted, and that the idea is to write questions. Is that correct? So that we can answer them afterwards. So we don't have to wait for questions in between. Is that correct?
Yes, Gary. We'll pose the questions to you at the end of the webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, if we could go to the first slide, please, that would be wonderful, Jason. When Dr. Lacro and I were sitting down sort of talking about this webinar, trying to identify what was most important for other people to sort of understand, what really came about was that we wanted to be able to help other people understand what type of architecture or infrastructure you would need at a campus or a system of campuses in order to embark down the path of sort of this reverse transfer pathway. And when we were talking about it, it really came down to 4 distinct processes or pieces or modules that you'd have to sort of come to terms with to effectively be able to implement reverse transfer at scale. And as I'll go through the scale, will come up more and more, and because it's really a scale versus resource type of challenge, we completely understand that these students deserve the credits and they should get them. But the question is, how do you get through all of the processes effectively and efficiently enough that doesn't cost you, $500,000 per degree just to get them through? So that's really what this is about. And the first part of that is policy. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Policy, although it can be very, very controversial and is ideally there's some type of legislation behind it with either funding or just bills or laws, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to 2 different things, and one is the opt-in versus opt-out. And I'm sure you've heard of this many, many times. And the opt-in is basically where a student basically has to opt in to accept the reverse transfer degree versus the opt-out, meaning if they have to basically say, no, I don't want it, or they will automatically get it, assuming they meet the criteria. Dr. Jason, did I get that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So as you can see, just from that one very simple policy, opt-in, opt-out, it can have very, very difficult and different consequences because the challenge is obviously engaging students. You know, they're getting X number of texts per day, they're getting X number of emails per day, and you say another one and say, hey, you know, you've earned a reverse transfer degree, please click this button to accept it. You know, that's one of their 500 emails they get, and they could easily then not see it and then not basically get the degree. Not that they didn't want it, they just didn't know the importance of the email. Versus the opt-in, they will automatically get it unless they say, no, I do not want it. And there's very few cases they say, no, I do not want it, and there may be issues with who's paying for the child support, things like that, where they say it's until graduation and they don't want to graduate yet with this because they're working on their bachelor's, and that as it may stop their funding source. So there are these rare cases, so you have to have that sort of available. And with the opt-in, opt-out, the other part of opt-in and opt-out is really, can you transfer all these student records across all these institutions, and that's where FERPA comes in. And ideally, what you'd like is when the student, again, when they're first coming into whichever institution, let's say community college, is set at that point, unless you opt out, your records will be distributed to the 4-year campuses and the 2-year campuses within that particular, you know, area or system that you're working in. And that opt-in, opt-out is so incredibly valuable to define, and it's very difficult as well. But if you manage to get it to the opt-out, you've basically solved most of your policy problems right there. And for the Hawaii system, it is opt-out. And Erica, do you know how we managed to get that?
There was a lot of discussion that probably went on for at least 12 months just at the chief academic officer's level, because there was a lot of discussion of, you know, what are the consequences to the students. So having the opt-out function is going to certainly allow you to award more degrees versus the opt-in. But I think it's also important, or it was important in our system's discussions, to acknowledge the fact that the transcript actually is owned by the institution. That's their record keeping. And so how you define those policies and have those conversations, I think you really have to aim it around, you know, what does the university have control over? And in systems where institutions are sharing common databases, where in Hawaii we're lucky to have a 10-campus system all on one banner system, that information can be interchangeable. So when you're working with institutions that maybe are not as aligned as well, you're going to have a lot more technical difficulty in making sure the agreements of that data sharing are available and are being handled appropriately.
Thank you. And in a sense, this policy, opt-in versus opt-out, will really affect the number of degrees that you're able to award. So even if you had the perfect technology and everything else was perfect, you're still, if you have to go with an opt-in, you're going to lose a large percentage of your return versus an opt-out policy. And the other thing that was very advantageous for us here at the University of Hawaii, and as Chancellor LaCroix mentioned, we are a 10-campus system, and the students actually, they believe they're part of the UH system. You know, yes, I am going to Honolulu Community College, but I can take courses at Windward just the same. You know, so, you know, our students even believe we're a system. You know, that's how centrally we behave. And that's, of course, very advantageous when you come to transferring these records over. Everybody just is already in the mindset that we are a system and that, of course, we can transfer because it's to the student's best interest. But the thing really that sealed it, or was the glue for us in policy, was the president of the system, Dr. Lassner. He came out with a memo stating that our system was the official arbiter of graduation, and that really helped any of the campuses or units who are a little bit stuck with, well, this doesn't seem quite right. And that really pushed over the edge that, yes, this is the decision, if that we are able to do that. So between those two policies, that we were really able to sort of cross all the bureaucracy out the way and really just start dealing with the actual problems of process and technology. So although it's very critical, we seemed, because of our setup, because of the tremendous work that our administrators have done over the last 10 years, it made the state of Hawaii, which we have approximately 60,000 students in 10 institutions, probably a lot easier than a lot of other state institutions. And we'd like to believe this may be a model for other states to follow as well. Okay, so from policy, let's move on to the next slide, please. Technology. Technology is unfortunate, but technology plays a large role in reverse transfer. And the reason is because it's such a complicated process to try and figure out what articulates and what doesn't. And there's so many thousand different courses in each of the different areas. And how do you get back? How do you say if they've met it? You have to basically transfer all their records back, articulate them all. And you might have all done it for nothing because they didn't, they weren't close or whatever it might be. So, if the technology you have is really advanced, it can reduce your workload to almost nothing. But if the technology you're using is sort of, let's say, more legacy or conventional, you could look at extreme resources to be able to do something like reverse transfer. So earlier when we were asked, could we define the technology models, we basically came up with 3 different models that any system that would like to do credit where it's due could come up with, and they were basically the decentralized, the centralized, and the cloud. And they all have their advantages and their disadvantages. If we could go to the next slide, it will explain a little bit about the different models. Okay, the first model is decentralized, and where you basically have your 4-year campus sending all their records to all the 2-year campuses. And then all the 2-year campuses have to send their records between themselves as well. So you can imagine how complicated, you can just see all the lines, how complicated this model is to do, because each, that particular record might have to be evaluated at each of the community colleges. So you basically have to wait to get all the 4-year records plus all the 2-year records, then do the evaluation campus. The next community college campus does the same thing, etc. So that's the sort of the type of system where you have the least amount of technology. But you're still assuming at the 2-year campus that you will have both a degree audit engine and transfer articulation. The basic model is you send your 4-year campus records back to the 2-year campus. They're articulated into 2-year campus courses. Then the 2-year campus runs that particular student with its articulated records through the degree audit and defines yes or no whether they have a sort of met the degree requirements for an associate's degree. The next model is the centralized model, and this is probably where most, when we were working with credit where it's due, where most campuses are at. And basically you have this centralized hub where you can transfer data to. So it's much more efficient than each campus having to literally send their data to every other campus in the system. They just send it to the central hub, and the central hub then disperses it out to the community colleges. So this model saves you a lot of time in terms of transferring and efficiency of communications of data. And a lot of systems that were in the original grant had these types of systems set up already in the center, this sort of central, and I think it might have been due to longitudinal studies, they had a sort of a model of a centralized data transfer system. Now, while this is a really good way to go about it, it still means a lot of work for the community colleges, because now they're getting all their records from one place, which is great, but they still have to go through sort of, if you think you're ready to iterate through, evaluate that student, then run them through the audit, say, okay, yes or no. Evaluate the next one, run through the audit, yes or no. And so it's a lot of resources on the community college to be able to do all that checking. And the third model is sort of the hybrid of it all, which is the cloud model, where everybody just sends their information to the cloud, and the cloud literally runs all the evaluations and all the audits and comes back to the campus with basically, here's the list, it comes out with a report, here's the ID, and yes, no kind of answer, whether they've met it or not. This is the least resource intensive in terms of human power, but it is the most advanced type of technology, so it takes a lot of years to get to that type of technology. So here at the University of Hawaii, we developed a third technology, which is the cloud technology, and it was because we had the ability to interconnect, and we really wanted to actually have pathways for students in our future, which is what we're doing now. So this helped build the pathways for students. So although we're using it obviously for reverse transfer, because a pathway in reverse is just a reverse transfer pathway, it allows us to do pathways both ways. And that's sort of what we want to show you right at the end, where we've got to by using this technology. So those are the three different models. Most systems are in the middle model. We're over on the right with the cloud model. And we can certainly talk to people if they're interested in the cloud model, how it works and why it works and what are the advantages and where it can lead you in the future. If I may, let's go on to the next slide. This is about procedure. Procedure is really about, okay, so we've got the technology, we've got the policy, but what do we actually have to do? What's the actual action that needs to happen? And so we developed a matrix of how or what action needs to happen. And what it allowed us to do is really map out the entire graduation pathway. And that's what this next slide shows you. So within our graduation pathway, on the far right is the conventional process, which is a student fills out a yellow piece of paper and says, I would like to graduate. And then the audit is done and all that good work is done, and the yes or no answer comes out of that. On the left is our new process, which is the automatic conferral. So with reverse transfer, it's part of an automatic conferral. So every registrar or graduation unit at a campus has this sort of big diagram like this mapped out on their wall. So reverse transfer comes through, and these are the number of the degrees that come through reverse transfer, and they can either come through complete, where the student is 100% complete by course articulations. They can come through and be 100% complete because of global competencies, and we'll describe more about that later, or some combination of that. And since we went to automatic conferral for reverse transfer, we also at the community college use automatic conferral for the certificates. So basically it lets a campus know who's earned their certificates. So basically the same engine that runs the reverse transfer runs through the students and says, hey, looks like you're eligible for all these certificates. We know you're in this Associate of Science program, but here are the accompanying certificates that you've earned thus far. And then part of that engine as well is any student who's at a community college, it basically looks through the records and says, hey, you're 95% complete. You should think for applying for graduation next semester. So we have now sort of tried to convert the idea of a student handing in a piece of paper to say, I'm ready, to now this automatic conferral process where the technology says, hey, it looks like you're ready, blah, blah, blah. So in a sense, reverse transfer really helped push all of that along, because once they accepted the automation from reverse transfer, they could then accept the automation from internally. But if I may let Chancellor Crow.
I think as states get ready to put these types of things in effect, the procedure is really key, because we all know we have changes in staff, and without something in writing kind of serving as the guidelines with who does what, who's responsible to look through all these graduates that the system has said, it appears as though you're done. And how the campus, because a lot of times when we adopt a new technology like this, it can be hard for people to completely trust the technology. So for our growing pains, it was really, okay, our system is going to provide us a list of these 40 students who appear to be ready. Yet, as the counseling staff, as those that are used to conferring these things by hand, they still need to feel as though they're a valuable part of the process. And in some cases, campuses will need to take more time in letting them kind of transition by really gaining faith in the system by going through those 40 and identifying, oh, they do all meet. We can trust this system. So being able to just put this out and say, here's the 40, grant them the degrees, I don't think for anybody it's going to work that easy, just because of the campus procedures that have existed, whether they're really formal or informal procedures. So that's one thing that we had to deal with. But the other thing is, as these names are popping up, there's going to be very unique situations, student by student basis, which then we realized we had to work out kind of reverse articulation, reverse articulation rules. So we may have a four-year institution that requires some type of 300 or 400 level ethics course, and yet the community college has its own ethics requirement. Well, then the conversation needs to happen to say, you know, the counselor may come back because they can be very rules driven. I mean, that's their job to follow those catalogs, and they're going to say, well, you know, I'm sorry, the system's wrong because they don't meet the ethics for our institution, when in fact they've done something above and beyond that. So then the conversation has to happen with the faculties in those disciplines to say, if this is a course that is more advanced than what we would require, truly we should be accepting that into our reverse transfer to say the student has really exceeded those competencies. So that's one conversation that probably took us several months to get over, and then had to be codified in a formal agreement signed off by my office to say, no, this is how we will handle these types of unique instances where students may not be showing up as meeting, but certainly are. I think also, as Gary talked about, the ability to build the automatic conferral with the certificates as they get built. So our campus has a lot of career and technical ed programs, which you may do one semester and earn some type of certificate. You finish another semester that builds on top of it. You've now earned a Regent certificate of some sort that's approved. And so as students can see those building blocks, wow, I finished and I achieved something, it gives them that motivation to look at, oh, if I finish next semester, I'm going to even have another certificate. And that sometimes can be the motivation to really impact that persistence and retention that we want to see students get to the associate's degree. But it also allows for them, if life does happen, that automatic conferral process has put something officially on their transcript that even if they can't continue into the third, fourth semester, they've got some kind of credential on their record that as they enter the workforce, they can say, well, I wasn't a dropout, I actually did finish something. And so I think that that has a lot of value to it as well.
Thank you, Chancellor Crow. And Chancellor Crow is so right. You know, I tend to sort of gloss over some of these details because I'm more technical, but absolutely right. We went through all these things, but I've kind of forgotten them. Where yes, the upper level ethics course was not accepted, and it had to go to some kind of communication and agreement, and you'll have that is such a beautiful part of the process because people can all see that we're working together, that nobody's getting hurt out of this, and I think that was something so valuable. That trust that Chancellor Crow talked about is so valuable. That building of this trust between each other. Because it's allowed us to get to the last step, which we'll show in the end. I think that may we have the next slide, please? Now the next slide is probably the most controversial slide here, and it became very apparent that we needed to be able to prove in some way show the data that what we were doing was worthwhile. And the challenge with that is because people are having to change, which we understand, do all this work to change, and yet are we actually going to get anything out of it? And in a sense, what we identified was a way to show what the output would be before we actually got to the output. And the way we've done that is we realized very clearly what the four-year graduation rate was. So take a certain example, the four-year graduation rate is 50%. So we know of all the transfer students coming in from the community college to the four-year campuses, 50% of them will graduate, and 50% of them won't graduate. So if you have, in our case, I think we had, let's just say, 1,000 students coming in from the community college to the four-year campus. Within, let's say, 6 years, doesn't matter the time frame, we know 500 of those will graduate with a four-year degree. And in theory, to get the four-year degrees, they somehow must have met the two-year degree requirements prior to meeting the four-year degree. That being the case, we know we're going to get at least 500 students basically that are going to be eligible for reverse transfer somewhere in that time period. Now, we're going to lose some students, and it's usually about 10% that we found out, because they actually graduate with a four-year degree and have not met the two-year associate degree requirements, which is quite strange, but it happens. But that's about 10%. And so you know that's the minimum degrees that you will earn, which is 400 for us. It was 400 a year. But then of those 50% that drop out, prior to dropping out, a certain percentage of them will get the associate's degree because they're working through the requirements. And we found that to be, that was of that remaining 500, approximately 300 to 400 every year were able to meet the community college degree requirements. So what we're actually saying, of the 50% that dropped out of the four-year campuses that were transfers, only now 10 to 20% of those students had no degree. The rest, the other 400 actually landed up with an associate's degree, and that's an incredible mark. And so what we've realized, by doing this, we've realized we have a baseline, and our baseline, based on this steady state analysis, is that we produce about 600 to 700 reverse transfer degrees a year. And so you can do all this math. So if a system or a set of campuses is deciding to do credit where it's due, you can do all of this beforehand. And so you can come up with a base number of what you will get out of reverse transfer. And if you're not getting out that number out, you're actually doing something wrong. And that's what we had two versions. Our first version, it was terrible. We were only getting 300 out. I'm like, whoa, something's terribly wrong. So we had to go back and figure it out, and we figured it out, and that's when we jumped up to 700. So it also gives you a mark to know when you're in the right ballpark. So knowing what you should be getting allows you then the momentum to give this information to people and help them to realize what effect it's going to have on them, that literally 80% of the students that are dropping out of your four-year campuses that are transfers will drop out with an associate's degree now. And that's a very, very powerful statement to make. So that's really helped sort of propel this all forward for us when we sort of went in and making the initial reasons, why should you do this? And that, I think, was one of the sort of factors that helped build the momentum. I think that's just about it. Jace, is there any more slides? I think. Jason, is there a next slide? I don't think so. I think the next is just additional information. Oh, lessons learned. I'm sorry, forgot about the lessons. Lessons. Okay. I'm sorry. Was there a slide on our outcomes, lessons learned? Okay. So the lessons we learned out of this was that course-by-course articulation is not going to get you the numbers of reverse transfer students that you should be getting. And the reason is, as Dr. LaCroix mentioned earlier, you have 300-level courses that meet all the hallmarks, or have the same competencies and more than the equivalent 2 years, but you can't say this 400 course is equal to this or equivalent to it. And so if you're just going to go on course equivalence, you're not going to get there. We're not going to get a sufficiently yield. Really, to get the reverse transfer degrees that are deserved, you have to include competencies as well, or area equivalents, if you want to call them that. And as Dr. Crow said, with the ethic was a good example of this. The other issue that we ran into is at the four-year campus, they may have waived a particular requirement let's say, diversification in arts or something. And at the two-year campuses, initially, they may have said, no, we don't accept that waiver. But we then sort of work through that as well to basically come to a trust agreement that if an advisor, authorized advisor, waives it at one campus, then it's accepted at another campuses. And so that really gave a bonding as well for the advisors and counselors to realize they could all work together between the campuses. So that I thought that was very powerful.
And I think once you have multiple institutions signing on to an agreement that says if you make the decision that fulfills that requirement, then we can also piggyback on that. It takes some of the fear out of granting these degrees with, not feeling completely confident that doesn't meet exactly what it says in our catalog. But when you think about it on a larger scale, hashing out those little anomalies is important because they can have such a huge impact on those that, as you go through this process, actually get awarded. But then that dialogue from faculty on different campuses having different graduation requirements, and then faculty within disciplines, that's probably, for us, was the harder part of the process than getting the technology, taking the data from the technology and saying, okay, they're eligible. That, of course, that was Gary's harder part, but our harder part was working through all of people's personalities, background, and buy-in and ownership of different courses to be able to say, no, as a system, we have decided that this is the way the majority should work. And so that's probably at the campus level one of the hardest things, but as a lessons learned, you really want to have all of those voices in the room as you start to pull those unique circumstances apart. That way you've got buy-in and everyone has really had a chance to give their feelings of what should be meeting what requirement.
Thank you. May we have the next slide, please? Outcomes. So one of the questions, well, if we know what we're doing, we got the technology, we got it all moving, it doesn't really show up in the numbers, right? And it does. And we basically get about 700 in all the community colleges, of which there's 700 of them. There's approximately 700 reverse transfer associate degrees awarded each year now. And it costs, in terms of labor, it costs between 50 and 100 hours system-wide to do this work, to confer those degrees. And initially, when it came into play, there was it allowed the community college degree awards to basically jump 25%. So it's when you look at it in that scale, it's really a 25% increase just from 50 to 100 hours work. Yeah, there was a lot of work that had to go in to make it all work, and a lot of communications. But now it's steady state. We're just doing it, and it's costing us now 50 to 100 hours of work. We're giving what they actually have earned, and it's a tremendous jump. I mean, if we had to take it away now, the degree curve would look really bad. So those are the outcomes. Can we get anything more out of this? No, we've maxed out what we can get based on our understanding of steady state analysis. So what we're doing now is introducing other degrees into reverse transfer associates. And do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So we started with the Associate of Arts degree, which tracks well as a liberal arts program, over to the four-year institution. But we've now, realized that we need a larger STEM focus. So the community colleges where they hadn't had a nice liberal arts track into the STEM field has created degrees like the Associate of Science in Natural Sciences. And those now can track into engineering, they can track into biology, or whatever hard science field that student goes into, where before we weren't capturing that because the degree requirements just didn't line up in the right manner. But there's also a number of career and technical ed programs within the state, 24 just at my college. And those, in some cases, are seen as very terminal degrees and won't move on, but in other cases, they are transferable to other institutions. So we're able to take those CTE degrees and track them into other four-year institutions where students may have only done a year in that technical field with us and then gone on because they decided they wanted a different track and gone on to the program that feeds into that, we can now go back and grant the Associate of Science degrees as well. So when states first start looking at this, it's good to take kind of that general cookie-cutter degree that the majority sit in, but knowing that that's not really the end of, the bucket's not empty until you track all of the degrees into where those pathways fit. And so with this technology, it's helped really identify areas where we may not have even known students were leaving us and pursuing a similar track in a different field that truly does track back to us, because we wouldn't have had that data. Those students just disappeared on us. But this data can really help align that, which then creates the conversations about should these programs that are career and tech education be better aligned between the 2-year and the 4-year institutions. Is this truly a terminal degree? And those conversations can happen between campuses to build stronger and more robust pathways for students as they really move forward.
Thank you. And if I may, Jason, if you could bring up that PDF of optimal point of transfer, because this is the end, and this is really what Dr. LaCroix was talking about there. Here's a visual of the software for those that can see it. And literally what you have here is a student that is at a community college but wants to pursue a 4-year degree. So his first 2 semesters, it shows you, so he has a pathway, even though he's at the community college, into the 4 years. So the first couple of semesters are at Honolulu CC, and then if you scroll down, it will tell him exactly when he needs to transfer. It says transfer, and then what he needs to do at the 4-year campus. So this work with reverse transfer and what Dr. LaCroix was just talking about is exactly this, is the ability to really go down the path the student wants to pursue and not lose credits in between. The real challenge is we could have never had this conversation without reverse transfer, because in essence this student is moving from the community college to the 4-year without earning an associate's. But that is no longer a relevant roadblock or constraint, because they're going to get it through reverse transfer. So we can now allow or permit, or everybody's on board, everybody trusts basically that it's okay. And that's allowed us to build this technology so the student can seamlessly know when to transfer and when to move, and they will still get their associate's degree. So that's it for us. I mean, honestly, if you ask what are the biggest weak points that I'm aware of, I think this is the University of Hawaii. We do only have 60,000 students. We don't have 1.5 million students. We did design this type of technology to scale to any type of size. But it's obviously a very, very different conversation when you're dealing with, 100 campuses versus, the 10 that we have here. And it would be interesting to see, and it's one of the topics that we've been bringing up, how do we get technology like this to scale, or how do we help others? And we're in conversations with other states about this type of environment and how to go forward with it. So I think those are our largest sort of stumbling blocks.
Well, thank you, Gary and Chancellor LaCroix, for your presentation of the work that you're doing related to reverse transfer, and what sounds like, I think an acknowledgement of how you're trying to, use reverse transfer to talk about larger issues related to transfer and articulation, as well as student mobility. One thing that we have sort of observed in several states is this acknowledgement that reverse transfer shouldn't be an afterthought in a student's pathway, but how can it be integrated into a prospective student's transfer pathway? And I think you all, with your technology and your conceptualization of student pathways, are really sort of moving, having that conversation and moving the needle on some important issues. So we have a number of questions that have come in, and we're going to try to get through a few of them in our remaining 10 to 15 minutes. One question that I think is important as a starting point is if you could briefly talk about the STAR system, and in particular how it interfaces with student information systems at the campus level. We've had a few questions about, what is your system. So can you talk a little bit more about STAR and how it interfaces with the institutional student information systems?
Absolutely. And this is a conversation that comes up all the time, and basically I'll tell you the endpoint. Perhaps that's easier. We've been in talks with MIT, and what that is about is I think it's Assistant Secretary of Higher Ed in Massachusetts really loves it and like to see something like STAR in his state. And so they had I think a workforce grant where they paid MIT to try and create what we currently see as a universal translator. And what that means to me is that you can stick STAR or any other ones of these educational softwares in any state. And so that's the sort of work that MIT is doing. So right now, STAR is hooked into this banner. It's actually a virtual banner. There's 10 campuses all virtually separated. And we use, it's just normal technology. We're also registering through the pathway so a student literally cannot go through the path, cannot take the wrong courses. But it's a lot of work. Let's say, I'll put a number on it. Let's say it's 2,000 hours or 1,500 hours of technical work to hook it up to a student information system or multiple student information systems. With what MIT is doing by creating this translator, you can now theoretically cost you 0 hours because it's a plug-and-play type of idea. And that's very, very exciting for the future of technology and education, so that you do get startups like this one, the STAR, being able to get across the nation to minority-serving campuses that don't really have the money for the more expensive products and services available on the market. And that, to me, is very, very exciting. This MIT thing is still playing out, but whether it's MIT or it's the next thing after MIT, I certainly believe the future is that we have to homogenize student information systems. Otherwise, the barriers to entry, the cost for the institutions is prohibitive. So that's something I'm very much pushing for this universal translator to talk between student information systems.
Great. That's very. It does, and there was a question of whether STAR was a homegrown system, and it was developed and built by your office, right, Gary? And it sounds like what you're doing is then trying to extend the work that you've done so other states and institutions can adopt it in the future. Adopt or adapt.
Yeah, you're very right, but our president is very clear on my directive. He doesn't want me going backwards, spending time, and that's where MIT could come in, sort of make it work for other institutions, because there's still so much in the future that we believe we need to do. But it's not really us being the architects. Yes, absolutely, it's homegrown, but the advantage we have that vendors and others don't seem to be able to sort of get yet is that we use the very newest technology, and by doing that, it's so much simpler for us to develop. In other words, if you use old technology, it would take probably 5 to 10 times longer to do this, because we're always getting the latest framework, which is way more efficient than the last framework. So as we develop, we go, here's a framework that's going to save us 89 hours. Let's adopt it. And that's our model, and that's what keeps us sort of on the edge, I think, and our real advantage. And if it wasn't for, like, Dr. Crow, with her vision, she tells me that, and then we go, oh, yeah, that sounds good, let's make it. In other words, that's not our ideas. We're getting it from people who've really worked it in education and know what the problems are.
Great. We have a couple of questions about some details of your reverse transfer process and policy. One was about the eligibility criteria. Could one of you sort of briefly just summarize what your criteria are for students to be eligible for reverse transfer?
I guess the easiest one to talk about would be the Associate of Arts degree. So because we've been working on articulation for probably the last 15 years to get it really a clean, smooth model where if one campus says this is going to transfer as History 151, we all agree on that. That's probably one of the big keys to it. So we have residency requirements, we have number of credits, of course, and then we have the individual, whether it's a humanities or your math requirement or your quantitative reasoning. or if it's ethics or communications, those all are broader categories, which then in most cases have multiple classes that could fit the bill for that, depending on where they took it. And the nice thing about reverse transfer is that it's not just between my institution and a four-year institution. The way we're set up is any student can be accepted to a community college and then just automatically register for any of the other community colleges. So our typical student is not taking only classes on our campus. They are more so taking one with Honolulu, one with Kapiolani. Maybe they went home for the summer to Maui and they took a couple. So the reverse transfer process takes all of that information of where those classes fit into all those little those boxes we need to check off as completed, and then it looks at, okay, what are the residency requirements across the institution, because the question then does come in play when you have students doing this swirling effect among many different campuses, who then gets that graduate, right? Well, so they're now at a four-year institution and they've taken classes at 5 different campuses. This isn't a flip the coin, it gets to go to this community college versus this. There needs to be very specific rules built into that. So they need to meet the residency requirements. We had to put more informal rules in play about, well, is it most credits or the last credits? And so which institution gets to really claim that graduation number? But did that answer the questions about the requirements?
Yeah, I think so. I think the residency requirement, the other thing that I think is important from my understanding of what you all do is you do look for students. You don't reach out to students to ask them to participate in reverse transfer until they've reached, is it 60 cumulative college credits? Is that right?
Until the system tells us they've met the requirements. So they have to have the 60 credits, but not just any 60 credits. We want to know that the system is telling us they have, in fact, fulfilled every academic requirement.
Because the technology is so efficient, we can, within a matter of hours or minutes, run to all the students and check. We only need to let the students know the ones that have actually met the requirements.
Great. Well, related to that is a question about the consent process, and one of the attendees asked exactly what is the process for obtaining consent from students?
Which consent? Was it the opt-in, opt-out, or the consent? Yeah.
Right. Basically, what's the process to inform students about their opportunity to opt-in or opt-out?
Did I get an email? So what would happen is we have a mass email that would go out once we verified that they do in fact meet the requirements, and that still does happen with a person, right? Because we even are not at the point where we get a list out of this information system and we automatically stamp the degrees. There's still a counselor that goes through person by person and spot checks and makes sure that everything is in the proper order. And then an email goes out to those individuals that we have identified now meet the requirements for a reverse transfer degree that says, congratulations, you, with all of the work you've done with the University of Hawaii, you now meet the degree requirements and you will be earning an Associate of Arts degree. Should you not want this degree, and it gives them some kind of instruction. I think different campuses may be different, contact this advisor, or you need to see the records office, or what have you. But it changes the way overall people think about graduation. I'm not sure how other institutions have handled, but for us, for all of these years, you actually had to be the one to show up with the yellow slip that says, I'm ready to graduate, and pay the $15 to graduate. We treat it very different now, where we're going to just automatically post that to your credential unless you tell us otherwise. But then you would come in and pay our records office if you decide that you want a paper diploma, or if you decide you want to participate in the graduation ceremony. So that has to change. That changes the conversation sometimes about funding as well, because it may be records offices may really survive on that graduation fee they've been charging for all of these years. So sometimes we had different bumps in the road because of all of these procedural changes. It really disrupted operations within particular departments.
Great, that's very helpful. And I do think a point that you made earlier, Chancellor Blackrow, is about, and Gary as well, is about sort of this opt-in and opt-out. And we do see, when we look across the 15 states that at least are funded by credit when it's due, Hawaii is the one that does have an opt-out policy, whereby if students don't respond, then and opt out, then they are, the degree is conferred if they meet the requirements. Whereas most other states have an opt-in policy, and I think one piece of advice that we have offered is that states and institutions reach out to the Privacy Technical Assistance Center for advice on this, particularly as it relates to FERPA. So I wanted to make sure that was communicated. We have a question about students who transfer to your four-year institutions from private institutions and students from out of state. Are those students part of your reverse transfer process and program?
To be quite frank, that's one of our largest downfalls, is absolutely no. So if a student comes from University of Idaho or Boston and comes to UHC Manoa four-year campus, we do not in any way participate in reverse transfer. We were initially trying to do the private institutions within our state, but they're so small, the ROI, when we sort of look through it, it just didn't pan out to the incredible amount of technical work that would be required. So if there is a larger sort of, and I know National Student Clearinghouse is sort of developing this type of model, that a sort of a larger model would absolutely be of benefit.
Great, yeah, and that's a great point. National Student Clearinghouse is working on a model for particularly students who, within states, but also students who move across state borders. So I'm looking at the time here, and I think we've reached the end of our webinar. We have a few questions that we weren't able to get to, but if you have additional questions that you'd like answered, please send those to us, and we can forward them on to our colleagues in Hawaii. The one question I think that we didn't get to that's probably worth mentioning, we had a few webinar attendees who were interested in maybe coming to Hawaii to learn about your system, Gary and Erica. So I think there's a few reasons that might compel some people to come to Hawaii to learn about what you're doing. So I'm sure you would welcome them.
Anybody would want to come to Hawaii.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
We've had several visitors from other states that have contacted Gary and made arrangements, and then we've been able to bring them around to the campuses and really show them where it's working well, maybe where it's not working, so they can think about the pitfalls before they jump in. So we're always open to that as well.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for your time and sharing the good work that you're doing in Hawaii. I think it was instructive to us and hopefully to many of the attendees who were able to participate in the webinar. So we, OCCRL, plans to host another webinar or two in the new year, and that information and those dates will be forthcoming once they're available. So we appreciate your attendance and have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.